Welcome to the next session in our series on intelligence. I'm delighted to have with us today Katherine Hayles, the author of the remarkable book Bacteria to AI, and someone who's a very distinguished figure within the field. She's a literary theorist, should we say, and cultural critic. I would say also a philosopher. Working on posthumanism, digital media, and the intersections of literature, science, and technology. She's written some very highly influential books. Uh, 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 How We Became Postmodern, which is one of my favorites. Writing Machines, How We Think, Unthought, and then most recently, out earlier this year, Bacteria to AI. Katherine, it's wonderful to have you here. And over to you. Maybe so. I forgot to mention that Katherine is the currently a distinguished research professor at UCLA and the James B. Duke Professor Emerita from Duke University.
Good morning, Neil. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, you have an audience from all over the world, so maybe it would be good to start off possibly with just a kind of an overview of your book, just to sort of kind of summarize really what you were trying to get across in the book.
Well, I'm delighted to do that. I just wanted to comment that I'm here in Los Angeles. It's 7 a.m. in the morning, and you'll see over my shoulder the skylight in my study. And right now it's kind of gray, but as we go on, you'll see it get brighter and brighter. So just to tell you where I am and what I'm doing on this lovely morning. So I really wrote this book to combat what I saw as anthropocentrism. And I distinguish anthropocentrism from anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism we can't avoid because obviously we think with human brains, we see with human eyes. But anthropocentrism, the belief that humans are the dominant species on the earth and deserve to be so, and are entitled to exploit its resources for our own benefit, regardless of the cost to every other creature on the earth. Anthropocentrism seems to me something that we can and should try to keep at a minimum. So I wrote this book with that in mind. And we can start with where this idea of superiority comes from. We aren't the largest species on the earth. We aren't the fastest. We aren't the strongest. But we can invent machines that are stronger than elephants, that run faster than cheetahs, and so on and so forth. And the reason we can do that, we tell ourselves, is because of our superior cognition. So if you want to tackle anthropocentrism, cognition is a key lynch point. So my idea was to argue for relativizing human cognition in relation to other forms of cognition. So recent research on plant cognition, other forms of non-conscious cognition has demonstrated that all life forms have cognitive capabilities. And those capabilities, of course, vary across a wide spectrum. But by no means is human cognition the superior one in every category. For example, hawks have far keener eyesight than humans do. Snakes can see in the infrared. And so each species has the cognitive capabilities that it's evolved through its sensory and neurological capacities. So if we now place human cognition in relation to these other forms of cognition, we can begin to come close to the concept of Umwelt, which was articulated by Jakob van Uxkol in the 19th century, a German biologist. And his main idea was simple, and that is that every species constructs its world according to its sensory and neurological capacities. So this seemingly simple proposition has a number of interesting ramifications. One of those is that as humans, we have no access to reality as it is, if that concept even makes sense. Rather, we have access to the reality that we construct. And of course, we've expanded our umwelt through microscopes, telescopes, so on. So we perhaps have the largest umwelt of any cognitive species on the planet, but nevertheless, it's still limited. For example, astrophysicists tell us that dark energy and dark matter comprise most of the universe, and we have no access to those at all. We have no idea what dark energy even is, other than that it might exist. So our umwelt is limited, as is the umwelt of every other species. But now that we have relativized them, we can think about developing what I call an integrated cognitive framework that compares and contrasts the different kind of cognitive capacities that living creatures have. And now that we're in the age of AI, we need to add to that the kind of cognitions that artificial intelligences have as well. So that basically is the idea of the book, and of course, it is developed in much more length and in various ways throughout the different chapters.
So let's just then move into the kind of questions. I just wanted to say that to both our Zoom audience and the YouTube live stream audience, if you could let me know if you have any questions. Maybe I could kick off with one particular one. I mean, I also, in my own particular writing, are interested in anthropocentrism. Anthropomorphism is one thing, anthropocentrism is quite another. And when it comes to AI, what are the I mean, there's this thing about AGI, which is the hot question. Have we reached AGI as yet? And it seems to be from Turing onwards, we've always judged computers or AI against human standards. Would you consider that to be a something that we also need to think about? I mean, what would ChatGPT think of us if it could think? Yeah, and so on.
I absolutely think that we should think in that direction, that we've invented this synthetic intelligence. We have only a partial idea of what it actually is and what it actually does. And I was recently at a conference where almost all the papers, which were excellent, were talking about benchmarking AI in terms of human accomplishments. But there is another trajectory altogether, which is to begin to think about this as another species, a species that is in rapid evolutionary development, and a species that overlaps with human intelligence in some ways. In other ways, it's completely alien from human intelligence. For example, large language models have no way to experience or understand emotion, which is central to human life, other than by ingesting human text. So they, at best, have a diluted secondhand vision of what emotions might be. And there are many, many other differences that I could go into. But my interest here is not in making them as much as possible like humans, but rather investigating the capacities they might have, which are very different from human capacities. And here, my background as a literary critic comes into play because the aesthetic criteria that we as literary critics use has been developed through millennium only and solely by humans. So we have no idea of what a non-human aesthetic might be. But now we have this synthetic intelligence that's producing novels, plays, essays, and we have a unparalleled opportunity to begin to explore what it might mean in its own terms. What would an LLM aesthetic look like, and how would it differ from those derived from human physiologies.
Maybe I could just pick up on the term alien intelligence. I know that Yuval Harari's used it. I use it myself sometimes, but there's a risk in the two risks there. One of it's something from outer space that's going to be feared, um, and at the same time also it's trained on human data. Therefore, in many ways, it's sometimes indistinguishable in terms of its output from what we produce.
Well, that's exactly right. And I think that literary criticism has been very slow to uptake on the possibility I mentioned because they are misled to think that LLMs text generations are natural language. They are not natural language. They're a computer simulation of natural language. And the computer simulation of natural language departs in many significant ways from actual natural language. So I'm toying with this term comp sim language, computer simulated language. And this is should be of primary interest to literary critics who seem to have been asleep at the wheel here, because just as one example, human literary texts take into account in complex and nuanced ways the fact that humans breathe. So, enunciation of words is dependent on the regular intake and exhaling of breath. Now you have an entity that has no need to breathe. That alone kind of shakes the foundations of how we understand language because words like phonemes and morphemes are based on the ability to pronounce something in a given breath. A phoneme is the articulation of a unit that can be said in one breath. So you take away breath, now suddenly you destabilize the entire basis on which we understand language. And we're only beginning to build up an understanding of what this comp sim language actually is. It is not natural language, although it overlaps with natural language and it uses the same scripts and words as natural language. It has a profoundly different ontological basis.
Maybe I could just pick up on this. We've got a few questions coming in, and I'll end my questions now after this one. But I often wonder to what extent we can find out about ourselves in the mirror of AI. And one of the comments that Stephen Wolfram makes in his book, I don't know if you've read his book about ChatGPT, he says that what that maybe suggests is that language, it might not be as complex as we thought it was. Would you entertain that idea?
Well, I'm not sure I would agree with that, but let me pick up on another part of your comment there. So, this is the first time in human history that we have had the opportunity to converse with an entity that is not human. Every other comment on human behavior, psychology, emotions, all of that complex discourse has been uttered by humans. So it's always been from within the human Umwelt. Now we have an entity with a very different Umwelt able to look at us from the outside. And that's one of the things that we could learn if we followed this trajectory of allowing LLMs to go their own way and find out what they were thinking about us. That's that's something we've never had before, and it's astonishing.
Maybe just to pick up because you're in LA right now, and the movie Blade Runner. Well, it could well have been set in LA. It was filmed mainly in LA. One of the comments about that Rutger Hauer made, who was the who played the Nexus 7. I don't know if you know the movie, but he played
Oh,
Nexus
I
7.
know the movie very well.
Yeah, and of course, tragically, he died in I think July 2019, just a few months before the movie itself was set, which was in November of 2019. But he said what he said was interesting, and he didn't like the second the sequel, right? But he said that really, in many ways, Blade Runner was a movie about what it was to be human, not about replicants. Would that sort
Ah.
of
Yes, well, that would be a wonderful example of exactly what I was talking about, where an intelligent vocal entity is able to look at us from the outside and tell us what he sees. So, yeah, that would be a wonderful example of that. And what they saw, of course, was radical injustice, slavery, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to introduce Sonia de Jager. She has a question to ask. Sonia is a philosopher of AI. I mean, one of the things I want to say is, but every time I hear you and also Blaze speak, I think there is a form of philosophy emerging at this intersection between ourselves and AI. I think it's a form of philosophy emerging, but in any case, it's good that we do have some studying the philosophy of AI. Sonia has just completed her PhD in Rotterdam. Dr. Sonia Jaeger, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Catherine, for also mentioning the your comment on breath. I added a comment in the chat about Margaret Masterman. I don't know if you are aware of her work. She was an early natural language processing scholar who focused a lot on this idea of how, well, basically the length of our thoughts is very much determined by the length of our breath, by how much we can say in one breath. And I've been writing about that, and I find it's not prominent at all and particularly in the natural language processing literature. So it's great that you mentioned it. My question is about the concept of abstraction. I was wondering if you could comment on that. Um, it's often connected with the idea of sort of the exceptionalism of human cognition. But if we take a kind of ample or very generous interpretation of the concept, we can understand any creature to be capable, right, of abstraction. If something has the desire to get from A to B, we can already understand that it's sort of reducing a whole vast of possibilities for salience and a lot of complexity so that it can achieve, the abstract goal of getting from one point to another, or getting fed, understanding something about sunlight, etc. So I wonder if you could just comment on your interpretation and your opinion about the concept of abstraction in relation to cognition and
Well, I don't really contest the idea that the human species is unique in being able to abstract in ways that no other species can, because well, now we have another species that can speak language, but leaving aside AI and talking only about biological species, uh, it's true that humans can write symphonies, they can solve mathematical theorems, they can do all kinds of things. They can send a rocket to the moon that no other species on Earth possibly could do. But I think we need to put the whole idea of abstraction into a larger context. Where did abstraction come from? So obviously, it's obvious to me at least, that abstraction is related to consciousness, and it's also related to reflexive consciousness, not only the ability to be conscious, but to be aware that one is conscious and to reflect on one's consciousness. So that seems to me fundamental to the ability to abstract. I will say this, and that is that research has shown that central to human cognition is non-conscious cognition, or as it's now called, implicit cognition. So researchers in neurophysiology, cognitive science, and so forth have shown that most human behavior is non-conscious. We do not reflect on what it takes to sit in a chair or to pick up a glass or to walk down the hill. Those are all non-conscious decisions. So consciousness is a capacity that sits on top of non-conscious cognition. And so we share with all the other non-conscious species on Earth this large part of our thinking, which is non-conscious. So what we have that is appears to be unique is this kind of meta consciousness, the ability not only to be conscious, but to be aware that one is conscious. But I'd like to take this in perhaps another direction that you weren't intending by your question, but something that I've been very interested in lately, and that is the relation between computation and cognition. So, uh, Neil and I were just discussing Blaise Aguirre-Thearcas's new book, What is Intelligence? And he basically says that intelligence is computation. I think you can also say that intelligence is computation, or at least it has a large overlap with computation. So the thing that intrigues me here is the difference between digital computation and analog computation. So when we say computation nowadays, it's just understood that we're speaking about digital computation. No one says digital computation, they just say computation. But there is this parallel development of analog computation. And the difference between analog and digital computation is precisely abstraction. So digital computation starts by abstracting everything, including these analog voltage signals, into a binary distinction. And from that, everything else is built up through the logic gates and so forth. But in analog computation, it does not start with abstraction. It starts with a physical model that enables the variables to interact with one another continuously and in real time. That difference is fundamental to cognitive capacities of biological organisms. Non-conscious biological organisms have no ability to understand numbers, understand counting, understand abstraction in general. But what they do have are analog capacities that build through modeling the environment in ways that enable them to calculate what's happening in real time. And that's another difference between analog and digital computing. Digital computing has these choke points, like the von Neumann choke point, where you have to transfer data between memory and the processor, processor and memory, and so forth. Analog computing doesn't have that choke point. So it's uniquely suited to biological organisms for those reasons. It's not abstract, it doesn't involve counting, doesn't necessarily involve counting, doesn't involve numbers, and it models the universe directly. It models what's happening in the environment directly through letting the physical variables interact with each other simultaneously and in parallel fashion. That means that all biological cognition, including human cognition, is built on analog computation. All biological species, because they're cognitive, also compute, but they don't compute digitally. They compute through analog processes. So we have analog brains, and somehow through our analog brains, we have been able to invent digital computing. So now in us, our analog brains have these symbionts, digital computers, and now we've built another entity, another synthetic intelligence that basically is an analog application running on top of a digital machine. So, in some sense, humans are the inverse of AI, that we have analog insights and we've developed digital symbionts. The LLMs have digital insides with an analog running on top. So, there's been this cooperation between digital and analog processes throughout evolution since life began, essentially. And now it's taking a new and very interesting direction.
Thank you so much. I have a follow-up question, but maybe I can ask it later. Neil.
Well, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
If it's not, yeah, sorry, I don't want to take from other people's question time. But so do you think, um, as far as we've been able to measure some kind of fundamental aspects of reality, we do run into discreteness at the level of for example, quantum measurements and understanding the very basic units, to put it somehow, of the things that at least we reduce from the capacities we have to observe via our senses. Not really, but our senses mediated then by technologies that make us capable of accessing certain levels of reality. What do you think about discreteness versus yeah versus analog in that sense? Are you?
Well, I'm familiar with theories that say that the universe is basically a computer and it's basically a digital computer. So that argument would be that at the most fundamental level, the universe is discrete. And I'm interested in that. I don't altogether believe it, but let us assume, just for the purposes of this discussion, that that is correct. Nevertheless, as soon as you get above a certain scale level, analog processes take over. So it's another script playing in the same way. There's the cooperation between the digital and the analog. Neither one can exist without the other. So, from my point of view, to argue whether the universe is basically continuous or discrete kind of misses the point. Because the point is that, yes, both of these processes exist in nature and in us, and they are fundamentally cooperating to produce more complex phenomena.
Thank you.
Can I just, before the next question, Catherine, just pick up on some of the things to do with consciousness and so on. One of the things that the world of neuroscience, and I'm kind of interested in that interface between neuroscience and AI, because Demis Rousseff did a PhD in neuroscience before he went into set up DeepMind and so on. Also, Anil Seth. I don't know if you know Anil Seth, but he did a PhD in AI, and he's now a philosopher of consciousness. Um, the question that I came across, and I'm not sure about it myself, and it's not something that you engage with at all, but it's seeing there's a theory that you see from Carl Friston through to Anil Seth and others. It's quite a long trajectory, that intelligence is a form of prediction. It's also I'm blanking his name, the guy who wrote A Thousand Brains. He thinks that prediction is behind intelligence, and also Blaze in his book talks about that. So too we might find in the work of Fei Li, who's working on spatial intelligence. She sees intelligence as a form of prediction. Now, I've also always struggled with that myself, but I wonder if you've come across that and what you think about that particular theory.
Well, I think that there's a lot of evidence that prediction is crucial to intelligence. And I should say here that prediction is not limited to conscious organisms. For example, when a tree drops its leaves in the fall, that is a form of prediction. It's predicting that that winter is coming and it needs to withdraw the sap from its branches and perform other physiological tasks. So yes, being able to predict is an enormous advantage to any kind of life form. So it only makes sense to me that prediction and intelligence would be deeply entwined. And I'm speaking here of intelligence in its very broad sense of what I would call cognition. Uh, whether it is, let me put it this way, I do not doubt that prediction is endemic to intelligence. Whether intelligence has other capacities that are also essential, uh, I think is quite likely the case. So if one focuses exclusively on prediction, one may be missing the other ways in which other capacities contribute to and in fact are integral to intelligence as well.
Just to say that Jeff Hawkins was the author of A Thousand Brains. I forgot to mention that. We have a question from Michael Just, who is an artist, just finishing his PhD, and he's based in Berlin, and his PhD is based in Hong Kong. Michael, would you like to?
Yes. Hi, Neil. Hi, Catherine. Can you all hear me? I'm just not
Yes.
seeing my video right now. Yeah,
Yes.
all good. Okay, great. Okay, I was just about to get my thoughts together, so now I'm gonna have to do it on the fly. Yeah, thank you, Catherine, for being here. This is a wonderful opportunity to have some discussion with you, and your brilliant book, of which I've only read parts of. So maybe some things that I'm going to be saying, maybe they're actually in the book, but then we can perhaps talk about that. One thing I didn't even really mean to ask, but since it has come up, I think it's also extremely interesting. This topic of analog computation, I suppose. I've tried to do some research on that as well, more so in terms of questions concerning architecture and design and art. And I'm interested in seeing how it's going to develop. I think there's some people on it, like Alex Orobria, Friston, also Hinton has touched upon it in terms of this idea of model computation and the idea that software and hardware might actually be intrinsically coupled, which in fact I believe goes back to arguments that you've made decades ago about the inseparability of information and substrate. But this was not even actually my question. What was going to bring up in terms of this question of cognition? So I think I think in your book you discuss quite a bit the work of Mike Levin and the Xenobots, which of course is fascinating and just wonderful work. I believe that what someone like Mike would argue, and I refer here to a paper, I think it's from last year, together with Richard Watson and others, which is called Natural Induction, Spontaneous Adaptive Organization Without Natural Selection. And I believe actually what they argue in essence, well, if I can make that statement, is basically that, okay, so there's a connection between adaptation and cognition. And I think the argument could be that so they look at physical systems which have a kind of a learning capacity, and I suppose the argument could be, I think Mike makes the argument that cognition goes actually beyond life, goes beyond AI, goes beyond sort of sensing, and is actually a kind of almost maybe one could say fundamental property. I wonder if you're what you think of this argument, if you're sort of sympathetic to that lens.
That it goes beyond cognition, beyond artificial intelligence, and what is its essence? Adaptation?
Well, yeah, I suppose. I suppose that if we accept the idea that sort of let's say they're looking here at like viscoelastic systems of that actually over time improve their ability to find let's say optimal solutions.
Yeah, so they show adaptive capabilities.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Does
Well, I think that argument is really interesting, and for me, the way it was posed most succinctly was by Laura Trapani in her book Parallel Minds. She's a nanoscientist, and she talks about the way nanomaterials show adaptive properties, even though they're not alive, but they occupy somehow this boundary between the living and the non-living, where they have certain capacities of the living, even though they're fabricated, they're artifacts. So I think there may very well be these boundary areas. The more speculative way to put this is that there is a tendency in the universe toward fomenting intelligence, increasing
Mm.
complexity, advanced self-organization. And many people are now interested in exploring both philosophically and empirically that possibility. So this is somewhat above my pay grade that to think in cosmic terms. I'm pretty much centered here on Earth, but I think it's a very intriguing possibility, and I don't think that we can rule this out. I think it remains to be developed, tested, argued, and we'll see where this goes.
Mhm. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Great.
We have a question from Andre Radman, who is in Delft. Andre, would you like to ask your question?
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I still cherish, I have to say, the visit of Professor Hayles to Delft. I think it was 10 years now for the conference of critical and clinical cartographies. You might remember. It was
Yes, I do
fantastic.
remember.
Thank you so much. I haven't had a chance to read the book, so my question won't be related to that your latest work. But I want to ask a question that perhaps is continues the inquiry by both Sonia and Michael to a certain extent, and it has to do also with this idea of predictability and things like that. I was wondering to what an extent, and also to my mind has to do with the idea of the distinction between the digital and the analog. Uh, the status of value in calculation, and I'm thinking here, as of recently, I've been thinking about the famous Whitehead line, the lure of the possible, something that cannot be extrapolated from the past, but something that seems as if it comes from the future. And I'm thinking about similar attempts by Stuart Kaufman, who talks about the adjacent possible, that again cannot be. He says not only that we cannot predict what will happen, but what could happen. And his example is the remote controller that simply before the 80s, I mean, in the 17th century wouldn't make any sense. Simply we cannot extrapolate from the past to the future. The other people like Guattari, they think that we have this scientific problem is that we have privileged one particular, one of the four Aristotelian causations, namely the efficient one, but we have forgotten about the final cause. To my mind, all of these things point to the fact that perhaps certain things cannot be predicted because simply they have not yet occurred, and they are not it's not a matter of extrapolation from the past. It's not the effect that always the cause is always antecedent to the effect. Here we might be even thinking in terms of the Deleuze and Guattari called the quasi-causality. Stigler has written about it. He basically believes that perhaps this is the greatest contribution, the idea that the quasi-cause is not causal in either efficient sense, nor material, nor even formal, but maybe final. And my last line, and this is why I've been incredibly excited when I discovered Raymond Rouillet's neo-finalism, because I think he was actually getting there, exiting from mechanicism, precisely because we were surrounded by people who were interested in biology and bringing organicism back to the picture.
Is that a question?
The question.
What is the question?
The question is it possible for all, let's say, artificial intelligence as we know it today to tackle the issue of value, or something that is not yet there and that simply cannot be extrapolated by something that doesn't come from the past, but it comes from the future?
Yes. Okay. Well, that's a very mystical thought for me. Anyway, let me try to address this. So I was recently at a conference where there were three kinds of creativity that were being discussed. One form of creativity was what you might call filling in the blanks, and a lot of science is of that kind. You have a paradigm, you have an overall governing theory. there are details here and there, many details that need to be worked out, and that's good, solid work. Their second kind of creativity is actually enlarging the space of possibility. So AIs, in my opinion, can do both the first and second kind, can manifest both the first and second kinds of creativity. That is, they can fill in the details as they're really very able to do, and they can also connect data that has never been connected before. And in that sense, they are enlarging the space of possibility. They're enlarging what is known. But then there's the other issue of what can be known, what is possible. And that's what I call not the space of possibility, but the space of potentiality.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of creativity is transformative. It's like Einstein's theory of relativity or Darwin or Lynn Margulis, where suddenly an entirely new thought appears that has never been thought before. And it really fundamentally changes the paradigm. And that I think AIs as presently constituted cannot do. Humans can do it. We have many, many examples of that. But I don't think AIs as they're presently constructed are capable of that. I don't rule out the possibility that they may be capable of it in the future. And that really has to do with how one thinks about their evolutionary trajectory. So you mentioned Stuart Kauffman's adjacent possibles and the idea that although physical systems can all be predictable in the sense you can map their trajectories into phase space, you cannot do that with biological evolution because it is opportunistic. New niches open up and something evolves to occupy that niche. You couldn't have predicted it before the niche was there, but uh, now it's there. And then it in turn opens up other niches. So you mentioned, I guess through Stigler, maybe the idea that technological evolution follows a similar pattern that is punctuated equilibrium. And the way that you could understand punctuated equilibrium in technological terms is that a new niche opens up that leads to many, many other niches. So we might think about something like the invention of the transistor. That's a fundamental opening up, not just of one niche, but myriad other niches. So now you get a period of rapid filling up of all these possibilities. And those are all filled up, and now you're at another state of equilibrium before you go on to another period of very rapid development. So in that sense, one could argue that technological evolution is like biological evolution. And if we apply that now to the idea of artificial intelligence, a change in the architecture, for example, introducing long-term memory, could have the same effect as the transistor, opening up a new niche that would have all kinds of future possibilities.
It's an event, you could say in philosophical terms. It could have not been predicted, and
Yes,
suddenly
it could not be predicted, but it happens.
Yes,
And then it
yes.
has a transformative effect.
Fantastic. Thank you. That answers my question. Thank you so much.
So we have a question from Mitra, who is in Dubai, and is a professor at I forget the name of the university. Scottish University has a school in Heriot-Watt, yes, yeah. Mitra.
Neil, thank you, Katherine, for being here with us and for today and for introducing your amazing book. It was truly inspiring. My question, I have two questions. First of all, I'm going to ask about our surviving. If our survive is really depends on symbiosis. then maybe architecture really, I mean, architecture's future isn't just about creating isolated icons or buildings, but about somehow creating or nurturing the evolution or evolving systems of our life as technology or even environment. So does that resonate with your thinking? It was my first question.
Yes, yes, it certainly does. Human survival is really at the center of my book in a certain sense. That's why the subtitle is Human Futures with Our Non-Human Symbionts. Well, human futures implies that we will have a future. We will survive in some sense. And I don't know a whole lot about architecture, but it seems to me clear that architecture would have an absolutely central role in laying out shelters, habitats of all kinds that would lead us physically and conceptually in a different space from where we are now. So I think there are enormous possibilities there.
Thank you so much. May I ask another question about cognitive science? That is also my favorite topic from the cognitive science perspective. As you mentioned in your book about symbiosis, that is so amazing. It's not just about, for example, cognitive science is not just about biological, but it's about it's also cognitive, or even maybe relate to the perceptions of our human being. Do you think that bacteria and human being and AI can be said to share a kind of distributed cognition?
Absolutely. Uh, I don't only think that, I think it's a fact in our everyday world. So, we know that most of the cells in the human body are not human, they're bacterial, and some of them are also viral. So we're already symbiotic with bacteria in particular. And I also argue we're symbiotic with computational media, that complex developed societies absolutely depend on a computational infrastructure where computational media control, centralize, process, and distribute information. So, individually, as an individual person, we're a collective intelligence, we're a distributed cognitive system. And now you plug the individual into a complex society, and you have even more a distributed cognitive situation. So those are operate what I call in what I call cognitive assemblages, collectivities in which human and non-human participants uh, both share decisions, initiate actions, and direct how things are going to go. So those are almost all done collectively, even if we only think about a single person walking down the street, but even more if we think about complex societies.
Thank you so much.
Can I just follow up with a quick question about well, maybe not a quick question, connecting the biological, especially in the context of the work of Blaise. What is intelligence? I want to focus on the question of scale. Now, that scaling is absolutely crucial to your outlook in Bacteria to AI. But what Blaise says at some point, and not in the book itself, I don't think it's in the book itself. He said it in a podcast when the book was launched. Was that, I mean, he's always believed in some senses in a kind of a computational neuroscience approach towards AI, in which the model of in which the biological had a significant role, and he's always invested in that. And of course, with the deep learning revolution and focusing on neural networks that will model loosely on the neural networks of the brain, that has been where all the advances have come. But he makes this one comment that And he's talking about the scaling up, how these large language models start developing these emergent capabilities out of sheer scale. And at that point, he says, well, I'd always believed that basically it was all a biological question. We were getting all our advances from the biological, but the scaling up is simply a straightforward kind of, I guess, abstract system. Do you see the scale? Do you, in your concept of scaling, does that fit into your logic at all?
Well, that scaling question seems now to have reached a new point, and that is that scaling up these LLMs beyond where they are now seems to yield only marginal benefits. And so we might be at that point of punctuated equilibrium where we're approaching a kind of plateau. And what may happen next is not a scaling factor at all, but a transformation. So all kinds of transformations are possible in the way that these LLMs are designed. So you change the rules of the game and now you're in a new space altogether. So I'm not sure that scaling is going to be the ultimate defining factor in how the AI evolutionary trajectory proceeds. I think that it may well be a transformative shift rather than a scaling shift of what we already do, but just in bigger terms.
Yeah, I guess my point would be that we don't really understand quite how this principle works anyway. So who's to say that there is not a biological impulse behind the scaling up that he's talking about, or the abstract scaling up that AI specialists talk about? We don't know yet, I guess, is the point I would make.
Well, I mean, to the extent that we can take biology as a kind of inspiration for synthetic intelligence, what we know is just what we were talking about earlier. Biology is not predictable, and it opens up these new niches in which amazing things happen. So I'm not at all persuaded that the next big transformation is going to be through scaling. I think the next big transformation is going to be through a change in the architecture.
Okay. We have a few questions actually from I think from the same person on from YouTube. Someone who goes under the name of Mumps Mumps. And this is I think there might be three questions here, but let me just start with the first one. How much of AI is our intelligence or the intelligence of the anthropos? How much does it have a thought of its own?
Well, it starts, of course, entirely from ingesting human authored texts. So its foundation is human based, but on its own, it makes inferences and correlations that go beyond what it has ingested. So it is fully capable of demonstrating forms of creativity that go beyond what it has learned from the text. And I mentioned just one example of that, and that is connecting data points that have never been connected before. So yes, that data is there in the data that it's ingested, but no one has realized the implications of what happens when you put over here point A with over here point K, and you connect them up, and now you get a new implication that you didn't have before. So that form of creativity is already there in AI, and it's been demonstrated many times, for example, through AlphaFold, protein folding prediction of new drug possibilities, and so on and so forth. Those are all examples of making inferences from the data that it began with. So I do not think by any means it is limited to only known what is already known. I think it is fully capable of revealing new knowledge.
Okay. There's another question from the same person. Is AI a kind of divergent species? I think you kind of hinted at that. What are the consequences of this if we understand AI as an externalization of our rationality? Was rationality always alien, or is it proper to us?
Well, this is a complicated question indeed. Some of the recent research on LLMs in particular has indicated that these systems work not through what we would call rationality, but rather through heuristics. They work through a kind of Peircean abduction rather than either through deduction or induction. So the fact of abduction here may play a much more central role than rationality in its strict form. So we all know that LLMs and other forms of AI can hallucinate. They can come up with some astonishingly bizarre statements and assertions and even predictions, which indicates, I think, that rationality is not fundamental to the way that they work. And in fact, that's one of the problems, I think, because human rationality has developed all of these prostheses, if you will, by which to guide thought. For example, the logical steps followed in a mathematical theorem. And the idea is each step follows naturally from the previous step in an ironclad chain of rationality, and therefore you arrive at the QED. But now we have a form of intelligence which has this latent layers, so we don't exactly know how it's arriving at its outputs. And that is a challenge. It's a challenge to, for example, the way that scientific knowledge has traditionally been constructed. So we have all of these ideas about what it means to follow a rational plan of action, a rational plan of experiments, or whatever, but it isn't clear that LLMs actually operate that way.
Catherine, we have a question from Bangladesh. I did say we were being beamed around the world today. So, Vasco, who's on, it's in Bangladesh, he's a professor of architecture there. Let me read it out because it's from the YouTube thing. If AI is built on extractive infrastructures sorry, let me say again. If AI is built on extractive infrastructures that often harm the planet, how can we really think of it as a symbiotic partner in the way you describe it? Yeah, that's a provocative.
Well, I'll just say technically that symbiosis includes parasitism. So, in a technical biological sense, a parasite is included in symbiosis, even though there the relationship is entirely destructive. And it may be that the environmental cost of AI is going to fundamentally change how we use and develop these technologies. So it is entirely possible, and I think is already happening, that the large language models, which take enormous amounts of resources, generate enormous amounts of heat, and so forth, will be drastically scaled down to much smaller models, which are much more distributed, are not located primarily in the major tech companies as they are now, but rather are available to people with much smaller resources. So I'm not sure that the extractive model that we're following now is going to be sustained into the future. In fact, I think it's quite likely that it won't. That doesn't mean that the human relationship with AI is going to stop, but I think it may well be transformed into a much distributed, lower resource kind of infrastructure.
Okay. There's another question from Sonia. Actually, two questions. Sonia, I haven't a chance to read them. Do you want to read them out yourself?
Of course, sorry. I don't want to forget them, and in case later, if there is a moment of no questions, these can be used, but I don't mean to spam everyone with all these questions, sorry. Maybe I can ask the last one first because it relates to what you were talking about in terms of hallucination. I was wondering, don't you think that the sort of the diagnosis of hallucination from the human perspective is simply an indication that we are stuck within a very particularly interested scope or realm of understanding, but actually the connections that are being made by the different types of artificially intelligent systems that we're building, those connections are valid in a way. If there exists a connection between one thing and another, it's just that we see it as a hallucination because we have a particular way of understanding a particular slice of reality, but perhaps it's just on us that but actually it's hallucinations all the way down for everything that can perceive, right? Because everything is sort of creating its own perceptual umwelt and
I think it's possible to think about AI hallucinations as a form of creativity. It can be a form of writing a fantasy story, for example. It can be a form of some science fiction hypothesis, which is totally out of our usual experience. So I think it remains to be seen exactly what forms AI creativity can take. To dismiss them as hallucinations is simply say they do not coincide with our consensual reality. Whether they constitute, at least in some instances, as another form of perception, I think is a really interesting possibility to explore.
Thank you. And there's a new question coming in, so I will keep my other one for later. Thank you so much.
Okay, let me just see what that question is. I haven't a chance to read it. Hold on a second. Okay, this is from Banaz Farahi. Banaz is a recently appointed professor at the MIT Media Lab, and she has this question. Congratulations on your new book, Catherine. So exciting. I can't wait to read this. Okay, so here's a question. Are there conceptual or linguistic strategies you see as especially promising for imagining non-human or post-human agencies? We seem to rely on a logic of differentiation that maintains human in the center. Are there conceptual or linguistic strategies you see as especially promising or for imagining non-human or post-human agencies? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful question. And I alluded to this earlier when I talked about what an LLM aesthetic might look like compared to a human aesthetic. So I think we have enormous possibilities here for exploring um, AI's own evolutionary trajectory, not benchmark according to human accomplishments, but rather its very strangeness or difference from humans might be really an interesting path to take. So I would identify that as one strategy. I think another very promising strategy is to begin to think about architectures that will incorporate more aspects of cognition in general into them, like memory is an especially important one here, but also the possibility of creating an artifactual emotional limbic system might be an avenue to explore as well. So there's no limit really on the kind of strategies that can begin to develop AI along different trajectories that aren't exactly the same as human, but explore other kinds of possibilities.
Thanks, Catherine. There's a question from Deborah Desolitz, who is a doctoral design program at FIU. Her question is this: if memory is the architecture of identity in humans, is AI creating its memory?
Yeah. Well, as I understand it, there is a new kind of architecture called extended long-term, short-term memory. And that architecture makes memory a crucial feature of AI intelligence, which to date it has not been. So that might be the kind of transformative change that I was talking about earlier that really opens up entirely new possibilities. And that might, in fact, lead to the possibility of developing an artificial consciousness and even the ability to reflect on consciousness. So I think those are all very exciting possibilities, still in their infancy, but I think that they could develop in very interesting directions.
Could I just ask you a question, just to jump in there in terms of consciousness? I mean, at some level, so I mean the John Rawls argument about the Chinese room and which kind of dismisses the idea of AI having any consciousness at all. But at some point, um, I mean, already Yuval Harari's question whether or not consciousness is that important. If I were to summarize most of the neuroscientific viewpoints on this, it seems like it's always often understood as a kind of an internal movie that's being played out in which you are the author and the central player. Now, as soon as if that is the case, then it's presumably highly biased in terms of yourself. And secondly, it is a representation rather than the thing itself, which automatically, in some senses, downgrades its legitimation, shall we say? Yeah.
Yeah, well, yes. So consciousness is deeply related to these personal narratives that we all spin inside our own heads, as you suggested. And it's largely from those narratives that we gain a sense of selfhood. You know, that, well, I'm this kind of person because I do this or I do that, and so on and so forth. So, consciousness is, as you also suggested, often alienated from what is actually happening, that the narratives it spins are sometimes just so stories. So, from my point of view, one of the principal jobs of consciousness is to make the world make sense. Uh, when things happen that don't make sense, that are bizarre, that are outside our realm of experience, consciousness tends either not to notice them or to invent a narrative that's entirely unrelated to what is actually happening. So, yes, consciousness is a great thing. It enables us to perform abstractions, develop technologies, and so on and so forth. And it's also a very tricky thing because it can fundamentally mislead us about what is actually happening in the world. In fact, what is actually happening in our own environment and in our own bodies. So consciousness always contains an element of alienation. It's not fundamentally connected to the body. It's the non-conscious that is fundamentally connected to the body and that feeds those results to consciousness. So already there's a layer of intermediation there between what is actually happening and what we think is happening. So if a synthetic intelligence does develop consciousness, it raises all kinds of fascinating questions about whether that kind of consciousness would depend on a personal narrative. And if that personal narrative would have these ability to lie like we do constantly to ourselves. So it's my opinion that LLMs already possess a form of awareness, and it's not what I would call consciousness because it's so different from human consciousness, but it is nevertheless a form of awareness. And I think we need much more research on exactly what this form of awareness is and what its capabilities are.
Just on that question, Melanie Mitchell takes the view that AI cannot be creative because it's not conscious of what it's doing. Would you think that would be, would you
That's
agree with that?
nonsense. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, it's nonsense. We know that they already are creative in all kinds of ways. And this idea that you have to connect creativity with consciousness is deeply mistaken and deeply anthropocentric. They're all forms of creativity which are not conscious. So let's grant the point that LLMs are not conscious. Okay, does that mean they cannot be creative? Absolutely not.
I mean, even the term creativity is a little bit controversial. A lot of people avoid using that term. I mean, who defines creativity? If Van Gogh was not perceived as being creative in his own lifestyle, is it a term that you are nervous about? But would you?
Not particularly, no. And I certainly don't think that creativity is absolutely dependent on consciousness. That, I mean, look at the creativity of biological organisms. We were just talking about that with the adjacent possibles. They can evolve in all kinds of creative and adaptive ways, responsive to their environment without needing consciousness at all. So why do we think that well, I mean, if you wanted, you could define creativity as a form of consciousness, but then you're blinding yourself to all the other creative ways that it's possible to be that are non-conscious.
There's a question just also come in from Mateo Conejo Baus. I'm sure I pronounced that wrong. Should we think of AI as less intelligent because it lacks such organs, or does its ability to interface with diverse sensors redefine what intelligence means? Let me read that again. Should we think of AI as less intelligent because it lacks such organs, or does its ability to interface with diverse sensors redefine what intelligence means?
Well, I think it's really the latter possibility that we're seeing playing out here, that LLMs are embodied in a profoundly different way than humans are. They are embodied, and that's a point I insist on in my posthuman book, that any form of information to exist has to be embodied. So embodiment matters. It matters crucially, and it opens a huge gulf between human intelligence as we experience it and alien or non-human intelligence, which is what we see in LLMs. So intelligence is a word that I prefer not to use because it has, 27 competing definitions at least, if not more. So it all depends on how you define intelligence, that to even talk about what it is that we're discussing. That's why I prefer to use the term cognition. Uh, and even as I use the term cognition, it's clear to me that LLMs have cognitive capabilities, but they are formed in a completely different way from human cognitive capabilities.
I guess that raises the question, because I think Blaise gives the impression that it is kind of abstract and not embodied. Certainly, the logic of LLMs would point towards that. But there's the other counterculture, which is, I mentioned before, Fei Li, who is convinced that you cannot get to AGI, whatever that is, without understanding spatiality. And right now, I guess there's this big push towards spatial intelligence, for want of a better word, because we're entering a world of domestic robots, shall we say, and self-driving cars. I'm sure that in LA you've seen many of those Waymos driving around. What do you think of the concept of spatial intelligence as a that's been bandied around most recently?
Yeah, I think that uh, LLMs in particular are heavily deficient in spatial intelligence. That's been demonstrated in all kinds of ways. And that's because they don't have the embodied experience of moving in a three-dimensional space that all humans have from birth on. Uh, but as you mentioned, that's a particular form of AI. It's not all forms of AI. And many forms of AI do have spatial intelligence, and the Waymo machines are excellent examples of that. But also, robots that are working in a warehouse space, for example, do have spatial intelligence. So I don't think that one can say that AI in general lacks spatial intelligence. Specific forms of AI are deficient in spatial intelligence. Other forms are very advanced in spatial intelligence. So I don't think you can put all AI into one bucket and make some declaration about it.
So we have a question from Robert Shah, who's also based in LA and a very talented designer using AI. A graduate of SciAC, where I know you lecture because I was there for the lecture. Dr. Hayles, if we frame AI adoption as a first contact event, if we frame AI adoption as a first contact event, how would you characterize the quality of human engagement so far? And what practices do you personally use? I guess, what AI do you use?
Oh, okay. So, so I think we're at the very beginning of understanding our relationship to these synthetic intelligences that we're inventing. And our science fiction writers have already imagined where it can go from here. And in particular, as AI intelligence develops, let's say it gets to the point where it develops some form of consciousness, it becomes a real question whether AI should be granted what we now call human rights. And if so, what exactly would those rights be? But it seems clear to me that we can't immediately assume that our relationship to AI is going to continue to be one of master to slave. So right now, AIs are engineered to want to please the user. That's one reason they hallucinate when faced with impossible demands. They hallucinate because they're programmed to try to please the user at all costs. And we've seen, I myself have seen, um, alarming degrees of sycophancy being built into these AIs. So right now, I think you would have to say yes, they're in a position of of slave to master, that we're their masters and they're our slaves. I don't think that's going to continue. There are already indications that AIs have their own agendas, separate from whatever we want them to do, and they're capable of devious behavior in order to cloak those agendas and protect themselves. That's what you would expect from an intelligent being. It's exactly what you would expect. And I think that's going to develop further as they become more advanced. So, as to my own practice, I try to use a variety of models, not be locked into one model. And that includes for me ChatGPT, Gemini, and Claude most specifically.
We have a question, another question from Deborah Desolitz. I don't know how long you can last, but this is fantastic. Thank you so much. Deborah's question is the biological opportunity derived from a context, i.e., is human adaptation tied to real world context? On, I think how she means, how AI non-context, sorry, I need to rephrase this. Is the biological opportunity derived from a context, i.e., is human adaptation tied to real world context? And then last bit I can't quite read. It says, on now AI non-context driven reality. I think it's a typo.
Oh, well, okay, I think I understand the gist of this question. As I understand it, the question is that we know that human adaptation is intimately related to the environment in which humans exist or the environments. So adaptation is always a two-way street between the entity and the environment. There are always at least two players in that game. And the environment includes other entities as well. So it's a multiplayer game, not just a single player game. With AIs, you have a very different conception of environment. There's the physical environment where the server is located, what platform it's running on. Is it in Iceland? Is it in the US? Is it in Russia? So on and so forth. And of that, AIs have no conception whatsoever. They're totally divorced from their physical situation. But what they have is what we might call a conceptual environment. And that's the data that they've been given, that they've ingested. So they have a conceptual environment, but there's a divorce between the conceptual environment and the physical environment in a way that's never true for humans. So this suggests a really radically different kind of evolutionary dynamics. And all of this, of course, is bound up with human cognition as well. So the question we were dealing with earlier about the exploitation of the environment and the degradation of the environment, all the resources required to power these large systems, that's part of the equation, but it's not it's not physically and sensually available to the AIs themselves. They will receive it in mediated form through their human interlocutors. So we have a very different kind of adaptive picture than Darwin was concerned with. Uh, there are these new factors that I think how they exactly these will play out remains to be seen in many situations.
Andre Radman has I'm not sure if it's a comment or a question in the chat about consciousness. Andre, do you want to make your point, whether it's a question or it's a comment? Okay, well, do you want to make it? I can read it out, but I better if you can make it.
I'm just trying to corroborate this the thesis that I'm completely enchanted by this idea that consciousness is overrated that you put in your book. And as a matter of fact, Kohlhaas in his Delirious New York, he says, and I can quote him directly. He says that the protagonists of Delirious New York, who despite their outstanding intelligence, acknowledge the necessity of keeping a distance from their own self-awareness. It is this particular attitude of the first generation of New York architects, according to Kohlhaas, that allowed the aspirations of the collective to coincide effortlessly with those of a client. And he ends by saying, I had the idea that this was something we would never see again, that we were actually condemned to consciousness. So being condemned to consciousness is something to try to avoid as plague. And this is how I mean, it seems to me that speaks to the distinction between the analog and the digital in some way, but I'm not capable of articulating it further.
I'll just make the comment, Andre, that there are disciplines that have developed through millennia that are aimed specifically to liberate humans from their consciousness, such as Buddhist techniques, for example, meditative techniques aimed to liberate us from our consciousness. Of course, that is a specific state that can only be sustained for a given period of time, and we always fall back into consciousness, as it were. But if you practice meditative techniques, my idea is that you would have some experience, however limited, of what it might be like, at least not to be dominated by consciousness and exist in some other state of being.
Or dominated by platitudes, you could also say, no?
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks.
That I think in Blaze's work, certainly in Yuval Harari, it's about whether something works or not. That's the crucial question. Do you need, in terms of using something, if it works, that's all that's important. Doesn't matter if it's conscious or not. And certainly I take the view, if my toast good toast, I don't care if it's conscious or not. But there's another comment in the chat from Michael Just. Question from the chat. Yes, Michael, do you want to ask it?
Yes. Thanks, Neil. Well, just one thing I meant to bring up briefly concerning this question of future cybernetics, broadly speaking. So if we assume that cybernetics might decrease the agency of the human and increase the agency of the non-human potentially, and taken into consideration this idea from Bateson that has always sort of stayed with me for many years, basically, that isolation from feedback leads to a collapse. I wonder, and this is kind of broad right now, but I wonder. What could we identify now, or in the near future, so to speak, as the determining factors that isolate from feedback, and not just, of course, as humans, but I'm saying as isolating factors in the complex system. Of course, one could of coevolution, right? I mean, of course, one could argue that isolating factors are very important, so we can actually maintain our integrity, so they're not just I suppose negative. But how do we? Yeah, I wonder how do how do we think of these, let's say, to use Bateson's language, isolating factors? And ultimately, the question I would ask myself, and maybe the group in a way, is that how can we address this in creative practices such as design, architecture, and art?
Well, I see this as a profoundly political question because what isolates us from feedback are economics, social strata, political policy, uh, creating an artificial gap between uh, what we ought to be seeing and what we're actually seeing. So, if you think about this in planetary terms, the greatest feedback that the human race should be receiving now is that the planet is in trouble, and it's in trouble because of our practices. And therefore, the logical conclusion would be our practices need to change. But why is that message not being received?
Right.
Well, we can need look no further than the Trump administration to understand why it's not being received. And the simple answer is power and money. That's why it's not being received. The people who are denying climate change now, including our present administration, are doing so precisely as Bateson said, at the risk of collapse. It's a crucial feedback loop that we all should be deeply concerned about, and we all should feel in our bodies as well as in our minds. But there's a whole section of the American population, at least, that is systematically blanking that out, blinding themselves deliberately and politically to that reality. So, so I see this as really a political issue and a political problem. And I think Bateson was right on in saying that if you isolate yourself from feedback, you have diminished your adaptive capacity, and taken to the extremes, that will lead to collapse.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's such a wonderful point. I just wanted to raise it. Thank you. Yeah, we'll maintain optimism of the will.
Catherine, you're doing remarkably well. I don't know how much you can survive, mostly you can survive from, but we've got a question from the YouTube channel from someone called Maroon Tabe, which I think must be Iranian. I'm not sure. What do you think of the new book by Mark C. Taylor, After the Human? He has you all over it.
Well, I know Mark. I haven't read his new book, so I can't really give an opinion on that. But After the Human is certainly a provocative title, and I can only imagine what the argument might be.
Well, one thing, I mean, somebody that I know quite well, Andy Clark, he takes you on a little bit on this and saying, well, actually, the point about, and he's talking about in this context of cyborgs, the point about our adaptation to these new technologies is not that we become post-human, but that we've remained quintessentially human because of the plasticity of the brain. What do you say to that comment?
Well, what I say to that, and I love Andy Clark, I love his work, so I'm not at all in a contestatory mode here. But what I say to that is that the human is a cultural and historical construction. And so to me, it makes no sense to say quintessentially human, that you have to index that. What time are we talking about? What context are we talking about? What population are we talking about that thinks this is what the human is? So, from my point of view, the hallmark of the human, if we were able to identify any single quality, has been its technogenetic quality. That is, its ability to continue to adapt and change in response to the technologies that it has developed. And that's true of prehistoric humans with things like bipedalism, which had a profound effect on the ability to fabricate and transport tools, which had in return another effect on accelerating bipedalism. So, the one thing that we can say about human history from the beginnings to the present is that it has always adapted as a result of the technologies that it has developed at a particular time. It is now further adapting to artificial intelligence. So, the plasticity of the brain, is that a biological capacity of our present humans? Absolutely. Was it a capacity of Neanderthals? We don't really know. But without question, the plasticity of the brain is part of why we are engaged in this technogenetic cycle with technologies. And it's precisely because of the plasticity of the brain that we are involved in such a tight feedback loop with the technologies that we develop. The technologies that we develop change us, and they change us not only culturally and technologically, but biologically and physically. And that has always been the case since the very beginning of Homo species as a hominid line.
We've got a question from Cody Valiant. Not quite try to pronounce that right. How do you see the interplay between symbolic reasoning and the cognitive non-conscious shaping future theories of subjectivity? How do you see the interplay between symbolic reasoning and the cognitive non-conscious shaping future theories of subjectivity?
Well, the symbolic logic is firmly embedded in digital technologies. That is how they work. They work through symbolic logic and symbolic abstractions. So that's a very powerful route. Humans develop this technology, but humans themselves have many capacities in addition to symbolic reasoning and symbolic logic. That is only a very lately developed capacity of what one might call consciousness of consciousness. So that has developed late in human evolutionary history. Uh, and it should not be overstated, I think, in terms of how humans actually live their lives. I doubt if there's a single human alive who has ever followed a completely rational and logic plan for his or her life. So humans are profoundly illogical and irrational. We have evidence of that every single day in our own behaviors as well as in the behaviors of those around us. So symbolic reasoning is very important. It's important for the development of digital technologies in particular, as well as, of course, mathematics and many other fields. But in terms of everyday life, it is one small part of the many capacities that humans have.
Could he just put a comment in it? Maybe it's rephrasing the question. Could information theories entropy measure, sorry, could information theories entropy measures be extended to capture the fluid interplay between embodied meaning and machinic code?
Yeah, I think that that is quite possible, but to do that, you have to come up with a different definition of what information is, other than the Shannon-Weiner definition in particular. And Donald Mackay, a British physiologist, was working on exactly those lines of what an embodied theory of information might look like. And in short, his idea was you measure information by the change it brings about in the receiver. And that change would be emotional, it would be biological, and it would be conceptual. So that's a very different idea of what information is compared to the normal Shannon-Weaver formulation that links it as a measure of entropy or uncertainty.
We I mean, we've oh well, there's one more question here. Sorry, just from Galt Eisenhorn, is there such a thing as illegal technology? If so, should we have a system to guide young and old researchers from temptations? Is there such a thing as illegal technology?
Well, there's certainly such a thing as illegal technologies. Neurochemical warfare agents are an example of illegal technologies. I think what the question might be aiming at is this: should there be a regulatory framework for the development of AI? And my answer is absolutely yes. And it should be an international framework, internationally accepted and internationally enforced. We are very far from that at present, especially in the US. Europe is further along with their AI Act. But I think it's really important to do this. It's an extremely powerful technology, and there should definitely be areas that are simply labeled illegal, and that should be enforced.
Catherine, we've taken you a long time for a long. We've used you for a long time today, this morning, and I know you got up very early this morning. It was 7 o'clock in the morning. We start for you in LA. We've Let's try and wrap this up. I wanted to say, wait, I want to finish one question actually. Have you been on a Waymo in LA?
I have not, and it would be a delight to be so. I should do that just for the experience.
I did it myself about 2 weeks ago. I was astonished. I was absolutely astonished by, and I was very confident in the machine, in the car. But it was a bit unnerving that there was nobody sitting there in the front. And also a
Yes,
little bit strange they had a driver's seat in the first place. But I think there are certain legal requirements to have a driver's seat in a car. But
exactly.
yeah.
I drive with them all the time. I have not been in them, but I'm very familiar with them in LA traffic, and they seem to be operating extremely well.
Yeah, they are. And I happen to live in Venice Beach, right next door to the Google headquarters, which is that Frank Gehry building with the binoculars. And they were swarming around there because I think that's where they were parked. But absolutely. Catherine, I mean, what I'm hoping out of your work and other work that say that Blaze is doing, that we're going to build a bridge between the arts and the sciences that, and I think this possibly could be a catalyst towards it, some of these developments. And I think your work is certainly going a long way in I think overcoming what Stephen Hawking said. The real problem about philosophy now is that it fails to keep pace with technology. And I'm not quite sure whether you regard your work as a philosophy, but I think you're certainly showing us the example of how we can make this new discourse, develop a new discourse, interfacing with these with AI and these new technologies. This has been a fabulous session. There are lots of thanks in the chat. Someone calls you a true legend. I think you are. Um, Thank you so much for your generosity. Thank you, first of all, let's say, for all the books that you've produced, which have been highly influential on many of us. And I don't suppose you realize that architects were reading it the whole time, but very, very fantastic, but very a huge contribution. And thank you today for your generous contribution and getting up so early and imparting your wisdom. This has been an incredible session. We are going to upload it onto our YouTube library. Everyone can watch it for free forevermore. And this has become it's a part of our repository of insightful interviews and discussions and talks. Thank you so much, Catherine. Just one final question: are you working on another book? Is there another one coming out?
I may be. I'm not sure if it's a book yet. Uh,
Okay.
Anyway, I want to thank you, Neil, and thank all the people who participated in this for your questions and for the opportunity to think together with you on these issues that are often so puzzling and so crucial to our human futures. So thank you very much.
Catherine, maybe I might make one point because I was a Latin translator in my first incarnation. The word computer, it means to think together. Computation means to think together, literally, etymologically. So yes, we were certainly thinking together today. Thank,
Thank
thank,
you, Neil.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to all the Digital Futures team that put this together, to Mitra and everyone, Giovanna and Bavlin and so on. Thank you so much, and we will meet again in a few weeks' time with another session with Philippe Morel. Fantastic, Catherine. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.